What if the woman whose name still echoes across 2,000 years was not, in truth, the seductress of legend, but one of the most learned rulers of her age, a queen who spoke perhaps 9 languages, who studied the movements of the stars and the flooding of rivers, and who spent her life trying to keep an ancient kingdom alive in a world that was slowly being swallowed by a single rising power to the west? Tonight, we will follow the long and quiet story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, from the marble libraries and salt harbors of Alexandria, through the courts of Rome and the palaces along the Nile, into the final years when an old civilization and a new empire met at the edge of the sea. We will look past the perfume and the whispered rumors, past the paintings and the plays, and try to find the human being who actually lived, the ruler who wore the crown of a land already 3,000 years old, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone around her, exactly how fragile that inheritance had become. Lower the lights, rest your head, and let your breathing slow. There is nothing here that needs to be solved tonight, nothing that must be remembered by morning. This is simply a long walk backward through time, along quiet corridors and moonlit shores, guided gently and without hurry. You may close your eyes whenever you wish. The story will keep moving slowly, patiently, the way the Nile has always moved. And if you find comfort in these calm journeys through the old world, in these evenings spent among forgotten cities and distant lives, you are welcome to subscribe and return whenever sleep feels far away. There will always be another chapter waiting here, another quiet corner of history to rest inside. Now, to understand Cleopatra, we must first understand the strange and beautiful world she was born into, because she did not appear out of nothing, and she was not, despite what many later imagined, an Egyptian in the way we might first assume. Her story begins not with pyramids and pharaohs of the deep past, but with a Greek city built on the northern edge of Egypt, a city that faced outward toward the sea rather than inward toward the desert. That city was Alexandria, and to walk through it, even in the imagination, is to enter one of the most remarkable places the ancient world ever produced. Alexandria had been founded a little less than 3 centuries before Cleopatra's birth, laid out by the surveyors of Alexander the Great around the year 331 before the Common Era. Alexander himself barely paused there. He was a young conqueror moving swiftly across the world, and he would die far away in Babylon only a few years later, his body eventually carried back to rest, tradition says, in a tomb somewhere within the very city that bore his name. But the city outlived him in ways he could never have foreseen. It grew from a fishing settlement and a scatter of coastal villages into one of the greatest cities on earth. A place of perhaps 500,000 people at its height, drawing in Greeks and Egyptians, Jews and Syrians, sailors and scholars, merchants and priests, all of them living together beneath the same wide Mediterranean sky. To picture Alexandria, imagine first the water. The city sat on a narrow ridge of land between the sea on one side and a great freshwater lake on the other, so that it seemed almost to float between 2 mirrors. Out in the harbor rose one of the wonders of the ancient world, the great lighthouse on the island of Pharos, a tower of pale stone that climbed hundreds of feet into the air, crowned by a fire that burned through the night to guide ships home. Sailors approaching from far out at sea would watch for that light, long before they could see the land itself, a single point of warmth glimmering above the dark horizon. By day, mirrors were said to catch the sun and throw its brightness across the waves. By night, the flame simply burned, steady and patient, a small sun tended by human hands. Behind the harbor, the city spread out in long straight avenues, wide enough, the old writers claimed, for chariots and crowds to pass easily, lined with columns and shaded walkways. There were temples to Greek gods and Egyptian gods standing not far from one another. For this was a city of blended faiths, where a traveler might see the goddess Isis worshipped in the old Egyptian manner, and also honored by Greeks who had adopted her as their own. There were markets heavy with the smell of spices carried up from the Red Sea trade, with grain from the fields along the Nile, with cloth and glass and papyrus and perfume. There were quiet residential quarters where families lived in houses built around cool inner courtyards. And there were the grand royal districts along the shore, where the palaces of Cleopatra's family looked out over the sea. And there was, above all, the museum and its library. We must slow down here because this single feature of Alexandria helps explain who Cleopatra was more than almost anything else. The museum was not a museum in our modern sense. The word meant a house of the muses, a place dedicated to learning and inspiration, and it functioned as something closer to what we might call a great research institution. Scholars from across the known world came to live and work there, supported by the royal family, freed from ordinary labor, so that they could study, argue, write, and teach. Attached to it was the famous library, which aimed at nothing less than gathering all the knowledge of the world into one place. The rulers of Alexandria are said to have ordered that every ship entering the harbor be searched, not for weapons or contraband, but for books. Any scroll found aboard was copied by the library scribes. Sometimes, the story goes, the original was kept, and the copy returned to the owner. We should be careful here, because the number of scrolls the library held is debated, and ancient writers loved large numbers. Some claimed hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Whatever the true figure, the meaning is clear enough. In this city, along these quiet shelves and reading rooms, generations of thinkers studied geometry and astronomy, medicine and geography, poetry and philosophy. It was here that a scholar named Eratosthenes had, long before Cleopatra, measured the size of the whole round earth with astonishing accuracy, using nothing but shadows, angles, and careful reasoning. It was here that the traditions of Greek learning were preserved, corrected, and expanded, and it was into this world of scholarship and inherited wisdom that Cleopatra was born and raised. A princess in a royal house that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years and had made its capital the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. That royal house was the dynasty of the Ptolemies, and to understand Cleopatra, we must understand her family, because it was a family unlike almost any other, brilliant and cultured on one hand, and stained with rivalry and bloodshed on the other. When Alexander the Great died, his enormous conquered empire, stretching from Greece to the borders of India, was too large and too new to hold together. His generals fought over the pieces. One of those generals was a Macedonian officer named Ptolemy, a practical and clever man who understood something important. He did not try to seize the whole empire. Instead, he took Egypt, one of the richest and most defensible lands in the world, protected by desert on either side and by the sea to the north, watered every year by the reliable flooding of the Nile. There, around the year 305 before the Common Era, he declared himself king. He founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 2.5 centuries, and Cleopatra, born in the winter of the year 70 or 69 before the Common Era, was among the very last of his line. Here we come to something that surprises many people. The Ptolemies were not Egyptian by blood. They were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of that first general Ptolemy, and for generations they kept themselves apart, speaking Greek, marrying within their own family, ruling Egypt, almost as foreign kings living atop an ancient native population. In the streets of the Egyptian towns along the Nile, ordinary people still lived much as their ancestors had for thousands of years, farming the black soil, worshipping the old gods, speaking the Egyptian language, burying their dead with prayers older than memory. But the family at the top of this world spoke a different tongue and looked back to a different homeland, and this is one of the reasons Cleopatra stands out even within her own dynasty. According to the ancient writer Plutarch, whose account of her life is one of our most important sources, though it was written more than a century after her death, Cleopatra was the first of all the Ptolemies to actually learn the Egyptian language. Every ruler before her had governed Egypt without speaking the tongue of the people they ruled. She, it was said, could speak with the Egyptians directly, and not only with them but with Ethiopians, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, Parthians, and many others, so that she rarely needed an interpreter. Whether the exact list is accurate, We cannot fully know, but the underlying picture is telling. She was a scholar as much as a queen, a woman raised among the books and thinkers of Alexandria, who understood that language was a form of power, that to speak to people in their own words was to reach them in a way no army could. But we should not paint the Ptolemies as gentle. They were, in fact, one of the most dangerous families in the ancient world, dangerous above all to one another. Over the generations, brothers murdered brothers, mothers plotted against sons, and rival claimants to the throne poisoned, exiled, and executed each other with terrible regularity. The dynasty practiced marriage between siblings, a custom that echoed the old Egyptian belief that pharaohs were like living gods who should not mingle their blood with ordinary mortals, but which, in the hands of the Ptolemies, became tangled with endless intrigue. Power in this family was never simply inherited in peace. It was seized, defended, and often paid for in blood. Cleopatra grew up inside this reality. She would have understood from childhood that a throne was not a gift but a struggle, and that trust, even among family, was a luxury a ruler could rarely afford. By the time of her birth, the once mighty kingdom of the Ptolemies was no longer the great power it had been. The dynasty had grown weaker with each passing generation, weakened by internal feuding and by the steady rise of a new and overwhelming force across the Mediterranean. That force was Rome. To understand the shadow that fell across Cleopatra's entire life, we have to lift our eyes from Egypt for a moment and look toward the north and west, toward the Italian peninsula, where a republic had been growing for centuries into something no one had ever seen before. Rome had begun as a small city, but through war, alliance, discipline, and relentless ambition, it had swallowed most of the Mediterranean world. By Cleopatra's lifetime, Rome controlled Italy, Greece, much of Spain and North Africa, large stretches of the eastern Mediterranean, and it cast a long shadow over every kingdom that remained. Egypt was still nominally independent, still ruled by its own royal family. But everyone understood the truth. Egypt survived at Rome's pleasure. Its kings needed Roman friendship to keep their thrones. Its enormous wealth, especially its grain, made it a tempting prize, and Roman politicians, always hungry for money and glory, watched Egypt the way one watches a rich and vulnerable neighbor. Cleopatra's own father, a king remembered by the nickname the flute player, understood this bitter arithmetic all too well. His hold on the throne was shaky, and to keep it, he had to bribe powerful Romans with staggering sums of money, borrowing heavily, and taxing his people to raise the funds. At one point, driven from Egypt by rivals and by his own subjects' anger, he fled to Rome to beg for help. And it was Roman soldiers who eventually restored him to his throne. This was the world Cleopatra learned as a girl watching her father. A ruler of Egypt could not simply command. A ruler of Egypt had to calculate constantly, weighing Roman power, native discontent, family rivalry, and the endless need for money, holding all of it in balance, like a person crossing a narrow bridge over deep water. So when we imagine the young Cleopatra, we should not imagine only luxury, though luxury there certainly was. We should imagine a highly intelligent child growing up in a palace by the sea, in a city of scholars, in a family where murder was a political tool, in a kingdom that was rich but weakening, ancient but fragile, independent but always watching the horizon for Rome. She would have been educated in the Greek manner, in rhetoric and philosophy, in mathematics and astronomy, in the arts of persuasion and argument. She would have known the poetry of Homer and the reasoning of the philosophers, and she would also, unlike her ancestors, have come to understand the land she was destined to rule, its people, its gods, its language, its long, deep memory stretching back through dynasty after dynasty into a past so distant that even the pyramids were already ancient monuments in her time. Think of that for a moment, quietly, as you rest. When Cleopatra looked upon the great pyramids at Giza, they were already more than 2,000 years old. More time separated Cleopatra from the builders of those pyramids than separates us from Cleopatra herself. She stood near the end of an immensely long story, the last chapter of a civilization that had already lasted longer than most civilizations ever dream of lasting. And perhaps, being the scholar she was, she felt the weight of that. Perhaps she understood that she was not merely a queen, but a guardian of something ancient, and that the tide rising against her was not just a rival army, but the ending of an age. The world along the Nile itself, beyond the glittering foreign capital of Alexandria, moved to older rhythms. Each year, with a regularity that had shaped Egyptian life since the dawn of the civilization, the river rose, fed by distant summer rains far to the south, in lands the Egyptians themselves had never seen. The Nile would swell and overflow its banks, spreading a thin layer of rich dark silt across the fields. When the waters receded, they left behind soil so fertile that Egypt could feed not only itself but much of the Roman world beyond. This was the true foundation of all Egyptian power and wealth, older than any dynasty. The pharaohs and the Ptolemies after them were in a sense merely the managers of this miracle, responsible for storing grain, digging canals, maintaining the systems that turned the river's gift into bread. When the flood was good, the land was rich and the people content. When the flood failed, hunger followed, and with hunger came unrest. The Egyptian farmer of Cleopatra's day lived a life that would have been recognizable to his ancestors 1,000 years before. He rose with the sun, worked the fields with simple tools, drew water, tended animals, and paid his taxes in grain and labor. His house was made of mud brick, cool in the fierce heat of the day. His gods were the old gods, Isis and Osiris, Horus and Hathor, deities of the river, the harvest, birth and death and rebirth. The same eternal cycle he watched, turning in the fields around him each year. To such a person, the distant queen in Alexandria was almost a figure of legend. But she was also, in the old Egyptian understanding, something more than human. The pharaoh, whatever their bloodline, was seen as a living link between the human world and the divine, the one whose proper rule kept the cosmos in order and the river flowing. Cleopatra, cleverly, understood this too. She would present herself not only as a Greek queen in the manner of her ancestors, but as an Egyptian ruler in the ancient tradition, even associating herself with the beloved goddess, Isis, mother and protector, so that to her Egyptian subjects she might appear as the goddess made flesh. This blending, this ability to be many things to many people, to speak Greek in the palace and Egyptian in the temple, to be a scholar among scholars and a goddess among the faithful, lies close to the heart of who Cleopatra truly was. The later legend would flatten her into a single image, a beautiful temptress who ensnared powerful men. But the reality was far more interesting and far more difficult. She was a politician of extraordinary skill, operating in an almost impossible situation, the ruler of a rich but fading kingdom in an age when one power was devouring all the others, a woman wielding authority in a world that rarely allowed women to rule openly, forced to use every tool she possessed, her intelligence, her royal blood, her command of language, her understanding of both Greek and Egyptian tradition, and yes, when necessary, her personal presence and charm, simply to keep her country and her throne alive. And so we arrive at the moment her true story begins. The moment she stepped from the shadow of her father into the full and dangerous light of power. Her father, the flute player, died around the year 51 before the Common Era, when Cleopatra was about 18 years old. In his will, he left the throne of Egypt to be shared between his daughter Cleopatra and her younger brother, a boy of perhaps 10 named Ptolemy, following the family custom by which brother and sister ruled together, and in this case were also formally married to one another as king and queen. It was an arrangement designed to preserve the dynasty, but it carried within it the seeds of conflict, for no throne was ever truly large enough to be shared, least of all in this family, a young woman of 18 and a boy of 10, jointly ruling one of the oldest and richest kingdoms on earth. In the shadow of Rome, surrounded by ambitious courtiers, each seeking to control the crown through whichever sibling they could dominate. From the very first day, it was a situation that could not hold. The boy king was too young to rule for himself, which meant that a group of powerful advisors governed in his name, a eunuch official, a general, and a tutor among them, men who saw the intelligent and strong-willed Cleopatra not as a partner, but as a rival to be removed. And Cleopatra, for her part, had no intention of fading into the background as a mere ceremonial queen beside her little brother. The struggle between them would grow slowly at first, then sharply, and it would eventually draw in the greatest power in the world, bringing Roman legions and Roman generals into the very heart of Egypt, into the palaces of Alexandria, into the story of Cleopatra herself. But that is where the next part of our journey will take us, into the years of civil war between sister and brother, and into the arrival of a man whose name still stands as one of the most famous in all of history. A Roman general chasing a defeated enemy across the sea, who would step onto the shores of Egypt and find, waiting for him, a young queen who would change the course of both their lives. For now, let the images settle gently in your mind. The great lighthouse burning above the dark harbor, the wide columned streets of Alexandria under the moon, the quiet shelves of the library holding the gathered thought of the world, the Nile moving slowly through the night, past sleeping villages and ancient temples, carrying its silt and its blessings toward the sea, and somewhere in a palace by that sea, a young woman who spoke many languages and understood the weight of the crown she wore, standing at the edge of an age that was ending, and the beginning of a story that would never quite be forgotten. Rest now. The night is long, and the story will wait for you. We will walk further together soon, at our own slow pace, through the old world and its quiet, enduring memory. The year was 48 before the Common Era, and by then the fragile arrangement between Cleopatra and her young brother had broken completely apart. To understand how this happened, we must move slowly, because the collapse of their shared rule was not a single dramatic event, but a gradual unraveling, the kind of slow erosion that so often precedes a fall. In the first years of their joint reign, Cleopatra had clearly held the upper hand. She was older, cleverer, and far more capable than her child brother, and the early official documents of their reign name her first, an unusual thing in a world that placed men above women, and a sign that she intended to be the true ruler. But the men who controlled her brother would not accept this. Slowly they worked against her, turning the boy king into a weapon aimed at his sister, spreading discontent, gathering support at court and in the army, and there were real troubles to exploit. The Nile floods in those years had been poor, and famine pressed upon the land. Grain grew scarce, prices rose, and the people of Alexandria, always a volatile and easily angered population, grew restless. In such times, a ruler needs someone to blame, and Cleopatra, as the senior partner, was an easy target. By the year 49, the faction around her brother had grown strong enough to drive her from the capital. Cleopatra fled Alexandria, forced out of her own palace and her own city. But she did not flee into quiet exile. Instead, she did something that reveals a great deal about her character. She went east toward the desert borderlands of Egypt and Syria, and there she began to raise an army of her own. She would not simply accept defeat. She intended to fight her way back to the throne. And so, as the year turned, Egypt found itself divided between two royal camps, brother against sister, each with soldiers, each claiming to be the rightful ruler. The two armies drawing toward one another near the eastern edge of the kingdom, at a place called Pelusium, the ancient gateway where invaders had entered Egypt since the beginning of time. It was at exactly this moment, with Egypt teetering on the edge of civil war, that the storm gathering across the whole Roman world crashed suddenly onto Egyptian shores. For while Cleopatra and her brother struggled over their kingdom, Rome itself was tearing apart in a far greater conflict, a civil war between two of the most powerful men who had ever lived, and the outcome of that Roman war would sweep into Egypt like a wave and change everything. To understand this, we must briefly follow the Roman story, for the two threads, the Egyptian and the Roman, were about to knot together forever. For years, Rome had been dominated by a rivalry between two extraordinary men. One was Pompey, called the Great, a brilliant general who had won enormous victories across the Eastern world and had long been the most celebrated soldier of the age. The other was Julius Caesar, a general and politician of equal genius, who had spent years conquering the vast lands of Gaul to the north, and had built an army of fanatically loyal veterans. For a time these two men, along with a third, had shared power in an uneasy alliance. But alliances built on ambition rarely last, and eventually the two greatest men in Rome turned against each other. Caesar, in a decision that echoes through history, led his army across a small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon, defying the law that forbade a general to bring his soldiers into Italy, and plunged the Roman world into civil war. The war between Caesar and Pompey raged across the Mediterranean, and in the summer of 48, it reached its climax in northern Greece, at a battle near a place called Pharsalus. There, Caesar's smaller but hardened army shattered the larger forces of Pompey. Pompey the Great, the celebrated conqueror, the man who had once seemed the master of the Roman world, fled the field a defeated fugitive. And where does a defeated Roman general flee? He looks for a place of refuge, a friendly kingdom that owes him a debt. Pompey had, years before, been a patron and protector of Cleopatra's father. He had helped the Ptolemies. Surely, he reasoned, Egypt would shelter him now, and so Pompey sailed for Egypt, arriving off the coast near Pelusium, in the very waters where Cleopatra and her brother's armies faced each other. He sent word ashore, asking for sanctuary and aid from the young king. Cleopatra's brother, expecting the gratitude owed to an old friend of the family. What happened next is one of the darker moments in this story, and I will tell it gently, for its horror lies not in gore, but in cold calculation. The advisors around the boy king faced a terrible choice. If they welcomed Pompey, they risked the fury of Caesar, who was surely coming in pursuit, and who was now clearly the winning side. If they turned Pompey away, they might offend a man who could yet recover. So they chose a third path, a path of ruthless political arithmetic. They decided that a dead Pompey could offend no one, and might even earn Caesar's gratitude. As Pompey stepped from his ship into a small boat to be rowed ashore, watched by his wife and companions from the deck, he was struck down by men he had trusted, killed on the shallow water at the edge of Egypt, the once great conqueror of the East ending his life on a foreign shore at the hands of a frightened boy king's advisors. His head was cut off, to be presented later as a gift. Within days, Julius Caesar himself arrived in Egypt, sailing into the harbor of Alexandria in pursuit of his rival. And when the advisors of the young king brought out their terrible gift, the severed head of Pompey, expecting thanks, Caesar is said to have turned away and wept. Whatever the truth of that moment, and Roman writers may have shaped it to make Caesar appear noble, the political reality was clear. Pompey had been Caesar's enemy, but he had also been a Roman consul, a son-in-law, a great man of Rome, and to see him butchered by foreign courtiers was a shameful thing. The killing had not made Caesar grateful. It had made him wary of the treacherous court he now found himself in. Caesar took up residence in the royal palace of Alexandria, and here the two great streams of our story finally meet. For into this dangerous situation, into the presence of the most powerful man in the world, Cleopatra now made one of the boldest moves of her life. She was still in exile, still shut out of her own capital, her army facing her brothers near the eastern border. If she simply waited, Caesar might well settle Egypt's affairs without her, might even confirm her brother as sole king, and leave her to ruin. She understood that she needed to reach Caesar directly, to plead her cause in person before her enemies could poison him against her. But Alexandria was held by her brother's forces. To enter the city openly would mean death. So she found another way, a way that has become one of the most famous stories ever told about her, though we should tell it carefully, aware of how legend and fact have blended over the centuries. According to Plutarch, writing long afterward, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace. She came by small boat at dusk, and to pass the guards, she was wrapped inside a bundle of bedding, or perhaps a sack used for carrying such things, and carried on the shoulders of a single trusted servant straight through the palace and into Caesar's presence. When the bundle was unwrapped, there stood the Queen of Egypt, arriving unannounced at night, into the chambers of the master of Rome. The famous later image of a queen rolled inside a carpet is a romantic embellishment of this tale. But the core of the story, that she came secretly, cleverly, and dramatically into Caesar's presence when it seemed impossible, has the ring of the woman we have come to know, resourceful, daring, and unwilling to leave her fate to chance. Whatever the exact details, the meeting was decisive. Caesar was then in his early 50s, one of the most experienced and formidable men in the world. Cleopatra was about 21, a young queen without her kingdom. Yet something passed between them, and here we must be honest that the sources give us more legend than certainty. The later Roman writers, who often disliked Cleopatra and wished to portray her as a dangerous seductress who ensnared great Roman men, emphasized her charm and her allure. But we should think more carefully. Caesar was a shrewd politician. He did not risk his interests for a pretty face. What Cleopatra offered him was real and substantial. She was intelligent, she spoke his language and understood his world. She was the legitimate heir of a royal house, and above all she offered Caesar a stable, grateful, and cooperative Egypt, with its immense wealth and its vital grain ruled by someone who owed her throne entirely to him. And Egypt's wealth was something Caesar badly needed, for his long civil war had left him deeply in debt. For her part, Cleopatra gained the one thing that could save her, the backing of the most powerful man alive. With Caesar's support, she could reclaim her throne. It was, at its heart, a political alliance of mutual benefit, though it also became, by every ancient account, a genuine personal relationship. And in time Cleopatra would bear a son whom she named Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar, claiming him as the child of the Roman general himself. But the young king and his advisors did not surrender their power quietly. When they discovered that Cleopatra had reached Caesar and won his favor, they were furious, and the city of Alexandria erupted. What followed was a strange and dangerous siege, with Caesar and a relatively small force of Roman soldiers, together with Cleopatra, trapped within the palace quarter of Alexandria, while the forces of her brother and the angry population of the city surrounded them. For months, through the winter of 48 into 47, the fighting swayed through the streets and along the harbor of one of the greatest cities in the world. It was during this fighting that one of the most lamented losses in the history of human knowledge may have occurred. Caesar, hard-pressed and needing to prevent the enemy fleet from trapping him, ordered ships in the harbor to be set ablaze. The fire spread, and by some ancient accounts, it reached the shore and damaged or destroyed part of the great library's holdings, or warehouses near the docks where scrolls were stored. Historians still debate exactly what was lost and when, for the library declined over many centuries and through many causes, and this fire was likely only one blow among several. But the image has haunted people ever since. The idea that in the chaos of a single night of war, some portion of the gathered wisdom of the ancient world went up in flames along the waterfront of Alexandria, smoke rising over the harbor where the great lighthouse still burned. Whatever the precise truth, it stands as a quiet reminder of how fragile knowledge can be, how the labor of generations of scholars can be endangered by the carelessness of a single hour of conflict. The siege eventually turned in Caesar's favor. Roman reinforcements arrived overland, and in a battle near the Nile, the forces of Cleopatra's brother were defeated. The young king himself, it was said, drowned in the river as he tried to flee, weighed down. The story claimed by his golden armor vanishing into the same Nile waters that had sustained his kingdom for 3,000 years. And so Cleopatra, who months before had been a queen in exile, hunted and shut out of her own city, emerged as the sole surviving power of the Ptolemaic house, restored to her throne, now firmly backed by Rome. To satisfy custom and appearance, she was married, in the family tradition, to another, an even younger brother, a mere child, so that Egypt might still be seen to have a king and queen ruling together. But no one doubted where the real power lay. Cleopatra, not yet 22 years old, was now the true ruler of Egypt and the mother, Soon, of a son she claimed was Caesar's own, before Caesar departed Egypt to return to his endless wars and his mounting responsibilities across the Roman world. The ancient sources tell of a remarkable journey the two of them took together. It is said that Caesar and Cleopatra traveled up the Nile in a great royal barge, sailing south through the heart of Egypt, past the ancient temples and cities that line the river. A Roman general and an Egyptian queen drifting slowly through a landscape older than Rome itself. Whether this voyage was entirely as romantic as later writers imagined, or whether it also served the practical purpose of showing the people of Egypt their queen restored and supported by Roman might, we cannot fully say. But we can imagine the scene, and it is a beautiful and strange one. The most powerful man in the Roman world, gliding up the Nile beside the last pharaoh of Egypt, passing beneath the towering columns of temples raised in honor of gods whose worship stretched back into the mists of time, the river moving quietly beneath them, the desert stretching away on either side, gold in the setting sun. For a man like Caesar, raised in the sharp, practical world of Roman politics, Egypt must have seemed almost like a vision from another age, a land of deep, patient permanence, of monuments so ancient they made even Rome seem young. And for Cleopatra, this journey was a statement to her own people, a showing of herself as their rightful ruler, blessed by the gods and secured by the greatest power on earth. The two of them, the Roman and the Egyptian, the general and the queen, the new power and the old, sailing together up the river of ages. But Caesar could not stay. The Roman world was still unsettled, his enemies not fully defeated, and his duties called him away. He left Egypt and returned to his campaigns, and eventually to Rome itself, where his power grew ever greater until he stood as master of the entire Roman world, holding authority no Roman had held before. And after a time, Cleopatra followed him. She traveled to Rome, bringing her young son Caesarion, and stayed for a period as Caesar's guest, lodged, the sources say, in a villa across the river Tiber, a foreign queen dwelling at the edge of the city that ruled the world. Her presence in Rome caused a stir, and not all of it kind. The Romans were proud of their republic, their ancient system of shared power and elected magistrates, and they were deeply suspicious of kings and queens whom they associated with tyranny. To see a foreign queen honored by Caesar, to see her son treated as something special, to see Caesar himself gathering more and more power into his own hands, alarmed many Romans who feared that their republic was dying, that Caesar meant to make himself a king in all but name, and that this Eastern queen was part of some dangerous transformation of their world. Cleopatra, whether she intended it or not, became entangled in the anxieties of Roman politics, a symbol, to Caesar's enemies, of everything they feared he might become. Those fears would soon reach their violent conclusion. In the year 44 before the Common Era, on a day in mid-March that Romans marked on their calendar, Julius Caesar was killed. A group of Roman senators, men who believed they were saving the republic from a would-be king, surrounded him in a hall where the Senate had gathered and struck him down. The most powerful man in the world, the conqueror of Gaul, the victor of the Civil War, the patron and companion of the Queen of Egypt, lay dead on the floor, and the Roman world was plunged once more into chaos and uncertainty. For Cleopatra, still in Rome or newly returned to Egypt, the news must have landed like the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had built rested upon Caesar. Her restoration, her security, her son's future, all had depended on the protection of that one extraordinary man. Now he was gone, murdered, and the Roman world was again a place of danger and shifting alliances, where no one could say who would rise and who would fall. She gathered her son and hurried back to Egypt, back to Alexandria, back to the palace by the sea, to wait and watch and calculate, as she had learned to do since childhood, while across the Mediterranean the Romans once more tore at one another, to decide who would inherit the power that Caesar had held. And out of that new storm of Roman ambition would emerge the second great figure of Cleopatra's story, another Roman of enormous power and appetite, a soldier and a leader who would become bound to her fate even more deeply than Caesar had been, and whose story with hers would end not in the restoration of a throne, but in one of the most famous and sorrowful conclusions in all of ancient history. But that too belongs to the chapters still ahead. For now, let the river carry us gently onward. Picture the royal barge on the Nile at dusk, the water dark and smooth. The temples passing slowly by, their great stone faces watching in silence as they had watched for thousands of years. Picture the young queen returned to her palace, standing at a window above the sea, the great lighthouse burning far out in the harbor, the news of distant murder still fresh, the future uncertain, and the weight of an ancient kingdom resting on her shoulders. She had survived exile, civil war, and siege. She had reclaimed her throne against every odd. And now, once again, she would have to begin the delicate, dangerous work of keeping her country and her son alive in a world ruled by Rome. Rest now, and let these images drift with you into the quiet. The lighthouse burns on through the night. The river flows without hurry toward the sea. And the story, patient as the Nile itself, waits to continue when you are ready. In the years after Caesar's death, the Roman world settled into an uneasy division. The men who had murdered Caesar, hoping to restore the old republic, did not find the peace they sought. Instead, Caesar's supporters rose against them, and after further war, power came to rest chiefly in the hands of two men. One was a young grandnephew of Caesar, a pale and calculating youth named Octavian, whom Caesar had adopted as his son and heir, and who would one day become the first emperor of Rome under the name Augustus. The other was a seasoned general and one of Caesar's closest lieutenants, a big, bold, hard-drinking soldier beloved by his troops, a man named Mark Antony. For a time, these two men, along with a third who would soon fade from importance, divided the Roman world among themselves. Octavian took the west, including Italy and Rome itself. Antony took the east, the wealthy and cultured lands of Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the regions bordering Egypt. And because the east was now Antony's responsibility, and because Egypt was the richest kingdom in the east, it was inevitable that the paths of Mark Antony and Cleopatra would cross. Their first great meeting has become as famous as anything in her story. And here again we must separate the glittering legend from what likely lay beneath it. In the year 41 before the Common Era, Antony, needing money and cooperation for his planned campaigns against the Parthian Empire far to the east, summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus in what is now southern Turkey. He wished to question her, for there had been accusations that she had aided his enemies during the recent wars. And he wished also, no doubt, to remind this queen who now held real power in the east. Cleopatra understood exactly what such a meeting required. She did not come as a nervous subject summoned before her master. She came as a queen, as a goddess, as the ruler of an ancient and fabulously wealthy land. According to the vivid account preserved by Plutarch, she sailed up the river to Tarsus in a barge of extraordinary splendor, its stern covered in gold, its sails dyed purple, its oars, the story says, tipped with silver, moving to the sound of flutes and pipes and harps. She herself reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as the goddess of love, attended by beautiful servants, while perfumes drifted from the vessel across the water to the crowds gathering on the banks. The people of the city, it was said, ran to see her, until Antony, waiting in the marketplace to receive her, found himself sitting almost alone, everyone having rushed to the riverside to glimpse the queen. We should read this account knowing that Plutarch wrote it long afterward and loved a fine scene, and that Roman tradition delighted in portraying Cleopatra as a creature of overwhelming, almost dangerous, luxury. But beneath the golden barge and the silver oars lies a shrewd political truth. Cleopatra was performing power. She was showing Antony and the watching world that she was no ordinary client ruler to be ordered about, but a sovereign of immense resources and confidence, a queen who could turn a summons into a triumph. It was theater, but it was theater with a purpose, and it worked. Antony, dazzled and impressed, accepted her invitation to come to Alexandria, and there began the long and fateful association between the Roman general and the Egyptian queen. The years that followed, when Antony spent long stretches in Alexandria with Cleopatra, became the stuff of Roman scandal, and later, of endless romance. The Roman writers, especially those loyal to Octavian, painted a picture of a great Roman soldier, corrupted and softened by Eastern luxury, seduced away from his Roman virtue and his Roman duty by a foreign enchantress, drinking and feasting and playing while he should have been serving Rome. There is a famous tale, again from Plutarch, of a society of friends that Antony and Cleopatra formed, dedicated, it was said, to a life of extravagant pleasure and feasting, and stories of lavish banquets, of costly wagers, of nights spent wandering the city in disguise. These tales are entertaining, and some may hold a kernel of truth, for Antony did enjoy the pleasures of life. But we should be cautious, because so much of this portrait was shaped by propaganda, by the deliberate effort of Antony's Roman rivals to destroy his reputation by tying him to a foreign queen and to what Romans saw as the decadence of the East. The deeper reality was, once again, political as much as personal. Antony needed Egypt. He needed its wealth to pay his armies, its grain to feed them, its resources for his ambitious plans to conquer Parthia and win the military glory that would secure his position against Octavian. Cleopatra, for her part, needed Antony. She needed a powerful Roman protector to guarantee her throne and the future of her children, just as she had needed Caesar before him. Their relationship, whatever genuine affection grew within it, and it does seem that real affection grew, was rooted in a hard exchange of mutual need. She gave him the means to pursue his wars and his rivalry with Octavian. He gave her security, and more than that, he began to give her and her children something extraordinary, territory and recognition that would rebuild the old greatness of the Ptolemaic realm. For a time, it seemed as though Cleopatra's careful strategy might actually succeed, that through Antony she might restore Egypt to a position of real power in the eastern Mediterranean. Antony granted to Cleopatra and to the children she bore him various lands and territories in the east, regions that had once belonged to the Ptolemaic Empire in its days of glory. In a grand public ceremony in Alexandria, remembered by history as the Donations of Alexandria, held around the year 34, Antony and Cleopatra sat enthroned before the people, and Antony proclaimed Cleopatra and her children rulers over various eastern lands. He declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, to be the true son and heir of the great Caesar, and gave royal titles to the children Cleopatra had borne to Antony himself. It was a vision of a new Eastern order, centered on Alexandria, with Cleopatra and her line at its heart, blessed by the power of Rome in the person of Antony. But this vision, dazzling as it was, carried within it the seeds of catastrophe, because it handed Octavian back in Rome the perfect weapon. To many Romans, these donations looked like an outrage. A Roman general was giving away eastern lands, lands that Romans felt belonged under Roman authority, to a foreign queen and her half-foreign children. Worse still, he was proclaiming Caesarion the true heir of Julius Caesar, which directly threatened Octavian, whose entire claim to power rested on being Caesar's chosen son. Octavian, a master of politics and public opinion, seized upon all of this. He portrayed Antony as a man who had lost himself, who had abandoned Rome and Roman ways, who had fallen so completely under the spell of the Eastern queen that he now served her interests rather than Rome's. He spread the story that Antony intended to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria, to rule from Egypt with Cleopatra at his side, betraying the very heart of Rome. And here we come to something important about how Cleopatra has been remembered, something that shapes the legend to this very day. In the propaganda war that Octavian waged, Cleopatra became the perfect villain. She was foreign, she was a woman with power, she was rich beyond Roman imagining, and she was, in the Roman telling, a dangerous seductress who used her charms to bend great men to her will and to threaten Rome itself. Octavian and his supporters, including the poets who wrote in his favor, crafted an image of Cleopatra as a kind of monstrous enchantress, a wanton and scheming queen, an enemy of Rome. This image was so powerful, and Octavian's side won so completely that it colored nearly every account of Cleopatra that came afterward. For centuries, the Cleopatra that people knew was largely the Cleopatra of her enemies, the temptress, the schemer, the exotic and dangerous foreign woman. The real Cleopatra, the scholar, the administrator, the shrewd ruler, fighting to preserve her kingdom, was buried beneath the legend her enemies had built. We should pause on this quietly because it tells us something true about history itself. So often, the people we think we know from the ancient world we know only through the words of their enemies or their admirers, through accounts written long after the fact, shaped by the needs and prejudices of those who wrote them. Cleopatra left us almost nothing in her own words. We do not have her letters, her thoughts, her own account of her life and choices. We have coins bearing her image, showing not a great beauty, but a strong-featured, intelligent, looking woman with a prominent nose and a firm chin, a face of character rather than the flawless loveliness of legend. We have a handful of inscriptions and administrative documents, and we have the writings of Romans and Greeks, most of them hostile or distant, telling us their version of who she was. To find the real Cleopatra, we must read carefully between the lines, looking past the legend to the intelligent, capable, and desperately embattled ruler who lived beneath it. As the rivalry between Antony and Octavian sharpened toward open war, the position of both Antony and Cleopatra grew more dangerous. Octavian, unable at first to attack Antony directly without seeming to start yet another Roman civil war, which the exhausted Roman people dreaded, found his solution in Cleopatra. He declared war not on Antony, a fellow Roman, but on Cleopatra, the foreign queen, casting the coming conflict as a war of Rome against a dangerous Eastern power, a war to defend Roman civilization against the threat of a foreign woman and her corrupting influence. It was a brilliant and cynical piece of politics. It allowed Octavian to fight Antony while claiming to fight only Cleopatra, and it cemented forever the image of Cleopatra as the enemy of Rome. The two sides gathered their forces for a final reckoning. Antony and Cleopatra assembled a great army and a great fleet, drawing on the resources of the East and the wealth of Egypt. Octavian gathered the forces of the West, and in the year 31 before the Common Era, the two sides met at last off the western coast of Greece, near a promontory called Actium, in a naval battle that would decide the fate of the Roman world, and, with it, the fate of Egypt. The Battle of Actium is one of the most famous battles in ancient history, though the actual fighting, as far as we can tell, was less a grand clash than a confused and ultimately one-sided affair. Antony's fleet was large but troubled. His forces had been weakened by disease, by desertion, and by low morale, and Octavian's ships, commanded by his brilliant admiral and friend, Agrippa, held the advantage of position and supply. The details of the battle are debated by historians, and the sources are not always clear, but the essential outcome is not in doubt. During the battle, Cleopatra's squadron of ships withdrew, sailing away from the fighting and turning south toward Egypt. Antony, seeing her go, abandoned his own fleet and followed her, leaving his forces leaderless. His navy and soon after his great land army surrendered or melted away. The war, in effect, was over, decided not by a great slaughter, but by a collapse, a withdrawal, a fading away of one side's will and cohesion. Why did Cleopatra withdraw? Here the sources and historians disagree, and we may never truly know. Octavian's side told it as cowardice or treachery, the Eastern queen fleeing and dragging Antony down with her. But other explanations are possible. Perhaps the withdrawal was a planned attempt to save at least part of the fleet and the treasury for a continued fight from Egypt, a strategic retreat rather than a panicked flight. Perhaps, seeing the battle turning against them, she made a calculated decision to preserve what she could. What seems clear is that after Actium, the cause of Antony and Cleopatra was effectively lost. They returned to Egypt, to Alexandria, to the palace by the sea, defeated, their great vision of an Eastern power broken, and awaited the arrival of the victorious Octavian, who now held the whole Roman world in his hands and who was coming, at last, for Egypt itself. The final year of Cleopatra's life, the year that followed Actium, has a quiet and terrible sadness to it. The sadness of intelligent people watching the walls close in and knowing, with growing certainty, how the story must end. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, and for a time, tried to continue their lives. Even the sources say, resuming their feasts and their pleasures, though now with a darker undertone, the gaiety of people who know their time is short. They sent messages to Octavian seeking terms, trying to negotiate some way to survive, to preserve Cleopatra's children, to find some ending other than total ruin. But Octavian was not a man to be swayed by sentiment. He wanted Egypt, its wealth, and its grain. And he wanted, above all, the final elimination of Antony and the neutralizing of Cleopatra and her line. He gave vague or false assurances, playing for time, moving his forces steadily toward Egypt. As Octavian's army advanced, first taking the eastern approaches and then closing in on Alexandria itself, the defenses of Antony crumbled. His remaining forces deserted or surrendered. The great general who had once commanded the loyalty of legions found himself abandoned, his power gone, his allies fallen away, alone at the end, with the queen for whom, in the Roman telling, he had given up the world. And here the story moves toward its famous and sorrowful conclusion, which we will follow gently with respect for the human beings caught within it, in the chapters that remain. For now, let us rest in the strange stillness of that final year. Picture the palace of Alexandria in the fading light, the feasts grown quieter, the laughter thinner, the great lighthouse still burning faithfully out in the harbor, as it always had, indifferent to the fall of kings and queens. Picture Cleopatra, no longer young, a mother of 4 children, a queen who had spent her whole life fighting to keep her kingdom alive, standing at a window above the sea, watching the horizon for the sails of the man who was coming to end her world. She had matched wits with the greatest men of her age. She had ruled one of the oldest civilizations on earth. She had come closer than anyone might have thought possible to preserving Egypt's independence in an age when Rome swallowed everything. And now, at the last, she faced the closing of that long, brave, doomed struggle, with the same intelligence and the same iron will she had shown all her life. Rest now, and let the images settle softly around you. The golden barge upon the river, the great ceremony in the marketplace of Alexandria, the confused battle upon the sea off Actium, the ships turning south toward home, the quiet, waiting palace in the final year, the lighthouse burning on. The story draws now toward its ending, but there is no need to hurry there tonight. We will walk the last of the way together soon, gently, as the light grows dim and the old world prepares to turn its final page. The end came in the summer of the year 30 before the Common Era, and though it has been retold countless times, dramatized in plays and paintings and poems across 2,000 years, we will walk through it slowly and quietly, remembering always that beneath the legend were living people facing the hardest passage of their lives. Octavian's forces reached the outskirts of Alexandria at the beginning of August. Antony, gathering what remained of his courage and his men, made a final effort to resist. There was a last skirmish, a brief flaring of the old soldier's spirit, in which Antony's cavalry even had some small success, but it was the last light of a dying fire. The next morning, when Antony went out to face the enemy, his remaining fleet and his cavalry went over to Octavian, surrendering without a fight, going over to the winning side as beaten armies so often do. Antony watched his last forces abandon him, saw the ships he had counted on join the enemy in the harbor, and understood finally and completely that everything was lost. The man who had once ruled half the Roman world, who had commanded the loyalty of tens of thousands of soldiers, stood almost alone, betrayed as he saw it. On every side, what followed is one of the most famous death scenes in all of history, though the ancient accounts differ in their details, and we should tell it with care without dwelling on suffering. In his despair, believing wrongly that Cleopatra was already dead, for a report had reached him that the queen had taken her own life, Antony chose to follow her, as a Roman soldier of his kind believed he should when all was lost, falling upon his own sword rather than be captured and paraded in disgrace through the streets of Rome. But the wound he gave himself did not kill him at once. And then, in a cruel turn, word came that Cleopatra was in fact still alive, that she had shut herself away in a great stone monument, or tomb she had prepared, along with her treasures and a few faithful servants. The dying Antony asked to be carried to her. The scene that the ancient writers describe is heavy with sorrow. Cleopatra, fearing capture, had locked herself inside the monument and would not open the doors. So Antony, gravely wounded, was hauled up by ropes to a high window, drawn up by Cleopatra and her women with great effort, so that he might die in her arms rather than in the dust below. There, in that stone chamber above the city, the old general died, and Cleopatra, the sources say, tore her garments in grief and covered herself with his blood, mourning the man who had been her ally, her protector, and, it does seem in the end, someone she truly loved. Whatever calculations had first drawn them together, whatever politics had bound their fates, at the last there was real grief, real loss, one human being weeping over another at the end of everything they had built. Now Cleopatra alone remained, the last obstacle between Octavian and complete mastery of Egypt. And she knew that her situation was desperate. Octavian wanted her alive, and here we must understand why, for it reveals the final cruelty she faced. It was the custom of Roman generals, when they won a great victory, to celebrate in Rome with a grand procession called a triumph, in which the victorious commander paraded through the city displaying his spoils and his captives before the cheering crowds. The greatest prize of all in such a triumph was a captured king or queen. A foreign ruler led in chains through the streets of Rome for the mob to jeer at a living symbol of Rome's power over the world. Octavian wanted exactly this. He wanted to lead Cleopatra, the queen who had been made into the great enemy of Rome, through the streets of the capital in his triumph, humiliated before the people, the final and most spectacular proof of his victory. Cleopatra understood this with perfect clarity. She was a queen who had ruled one of the oldest civilizations on earth, who traced her line back through 3 centuries of Ptolemaic kings, who had presented herself as a living goddess to her people. The thought of being dragged through Rome in chains, a captive spectacle for the amusement of the crowd, was to her a fate worse than death. And so, in the days after Antony's death, even as she negotiated with Octavian and was taken into his custody, watched carefully by his guards precisely so that she could not harm herself, she was quietly preparing her own ending, one that would deny Octavian his prize and preserve, at the last, her dignity as a queen. Octavian himself came to see her, and the sources describe a tense meeting between the young Roman victor and the defeated queen. He spoke to her with careful politeness, reassuring her, making promises about her safety and the treatment of her children, all the while intending, it seems, to keep her alive for his triumph. Cleopatra, for her part, played her role, appearing to accept his authority, perhaps even, some accounts suggest, testing whether she might yet win him over as she had won Caesar and Antony, though Octavian was a colder and more guarded man than either. But she was not deceived. She understood what awaited her in Rome, and she had no intention of going there as a captive. The manner of her death is the most famous detail of all, and also one of the most uncertain, so we should tell it honestly. The tradition that has come down through the ages, preserved by Plutarch and others, is that Cleopatra had a venomous snake, an asp, which is likely the Egyptian cobra, smuggled to her, hidden, some say in a basket of figs brought past the guards, and that she allowed the serpent to bite her, dying from its poison. There is a deep and deliberate meaning in this image, if it is true, for the cobra was a sacred symbol of Egyptian royalty, worn upon the crowns of the pharaohs as a sign of divine protection, and death by such a creature would have carried, for an Egyptian queen, a kind of sacred and royal significance, a return to the gods rather than a mere suicide. But historians have long debated whether the snake story is fact or a beautiful later embellishment. Some ancient writers themselves were uncertain, noting that no one truly saw what happened, that there were faint marks that might have been snake bites, or might have been something else. Other accounts suggest she may have used poison by some other means, perhaps a hidden vial, perhaps a poisoned pin or comb. The plain truth is that we do not know with certainty exactly how Cleopatra died. What we know is that she died by her own choice, in her own way, refusing to be led in chains through Rome, taking control of her own ending when everything else had been taken from her. When Octavian's men came to her chamber, they found her already dead, laid out, the story says, in her royal robes upon a golden couch, adorned as a queen, with her 2 faithful serving women dying or dead beside her, women who had chosen to follow their mistress to the end. One of them, as the guards burst in demanding whether this was well done, is said to have answered that it was indeed well done, and fitting for a queen descended from so many kings before she too died. Whether these final words are exactly true or were shaped by later writers into something noble and fitting, they capture something real about how even her enemies came to see her end, with a kind of reluctant admiration for the dignity and courage of the woman who had denied Octavian his prize. She was about 39 years old. She had reigned for some 21 years, and with her death, an immense chapter of human history came quietly to its close. Though the people of the time may not have grasped the full weight of what had ended, for Cleopatra was not only the last of the Ptolemies, she was the last pharaoh of Egypt. Behind her stretched 3,000 years of Egyptian kingship, an unbroken chain of rulers reaching back to the very dawn of civilization along the Nile, back before the pyramids, back into the deepest antiquity of the human story. And now that chain ended, there would never be another pharaoh. Egypt, the ancient land that had endured through the rise and fall of so many empires, that had seemed almost eternal, now passed under the direct rule of Rome, becoming a province, a possession, its wealth and its grain flowing to feed the city of Rome and its people, its long independence finished at last. Octavian, denied his living captive, is said to have been genuinely annoyed that Cleopatra had escaped him in death, though he allowed her to be buried, as she had wished, beside Antony, the 2 of them laid to rest together in her city by the sea. He carried an image or effigy of her in his triumph in Rome instead of the living queen, a poor substitute for the prize he had wanted. But he had won everything that mattered. He was now the undisputed master of the entire Roman world. Within a few years he would take the name Augustus and become, in all but name, the first emperor of Rome, transforming the old republic into an empire that would endure for centuries. The long chaos of Roman civil wars was over, and a new age had begun, and it had begun in a very real sense, on the shores of Egypt, with the death of the last pharaoh. As for Cleopatra's children, their fates form a quiet and poignant coda to her story. Her son Caesarion, the child she had borne to Julius Caesar and named as heir, was the greatest danger to Octavian, for he was the natural son of the great Caesar, and Octavian's power rested on being Caesar's chosen son. There could not be 2 heirs of Caesar in the world. Caesarion, then a teenager, had been sent away for safety, but he was caught or lured back, and Octavian, following the cold logic of power, had the young man killed. It is said that one of Octavian's advisors justified the deed with a grim play on words, that it was not good to have too many Caesars. And so the son of Cleopatra and Caesar, the last hope of the Ptolemaic line as rulers, was quietly eliminated. Another young life ended in the machinery of empire. But Cleopatra's 3 younger children, the ones she had borne to Mark Antony, were spared. They were taken to Rome, and here the story softens. Unexpectedly, they were placed in the care of Antony's Roman widow, Octavia, who was also Octavian's own sister, a woman remembered for her dignity and kindness, and who, remarkably, raised the children of her late husband and his foreign lover as part of her own household. Of these 3 children, the daughter, named Cleopatra Selene after her mother and after the moon, grew up and was married, in time, to a North African king named Juba, a learned and cultured ruler, and she became a queen in her own right in the lands of North Africa, far to the west of her mother's Egypt. Through her, Some faint thread of Cleopatra's blood is thought to have continued into later royal lines of the region for a generation or two. So the great queen's line did not vanish entirely in that terrible summer. It flowed on, quietly, in gentler channels, in the person of a daughter who ruled peacefully in a distant land and who carried her mother's name and perhaps some memory of the mother she had lost when she was only a small child. And what of Alexandria itself, the shining city where so much of this story unfolded? It did not fall when Cleopatra fell. Cities are more durable than the rulers who dwell in them, and Alexandria endured for centuries more under Roman rule, remaining one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a center of trade and learning and faith. Its great lighthouse continued to burn, guiding ships into the harbor for hundreds of years, standing until earthquakes in the medieval age finally brought it down, its stones tumbling at last into the sea where its foundations are still explored by divers today. The library and the tradition of scholarship it embodied gradually declined over the following centuries, worn away by neglect, by changing times, by fire and conflict, and the slow shifting of the world's attention, until the great gathering of knowledge that had made Alexandria the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean faded away. One of the quiet, immeasurable losses of history, the city became, in time, a great center of early Christianity, its temples to the old gods eventually falling silent, the worship of Isis and Osiris, and all the ancient deities fading as a new faith spread across the Roman world. And later still, Alexandria would pass under Arab rule, and a new city, Cairo, would rise to become Egypt's heart. While Alexandria settled into a long, quieter existence, a shadow of its ancient glory, though it lives yet today, a busy modern city built atop the drowned and buried remains of the world that Cleopatra knew. The tomb of Cleopatra and Antony, where the last pharaoh and the Roman general were laid to rest together, has never been found. For 2,000 years, its location has been lost, and archaeologists still search for it, digging along the Egyptian coast, exploring beneath the waters of the old harbor, where much of ancient Alexandria now lies submerged, drowned by earthquakes and the slow rising of the sea. Some believe the tomb may lie beneath the modern city, its stones built over long ago. Some believe it may rest beneath the waves, in the sunken quarters of the ancient city that now form an underwater landscape of fallen columns and scattered statues on the seabed. Others search farther afield, at temple sites outside the city, following theories and clues that may or may not lead anywhere. So far, the resting place of one of the most famous women in all of history remains a quiet mystery, hidden somewhere beneath the sand or the sea, waiting perhaps to be found, or perhaps never to be found at all. There is something fitting in this, something that suits the woman herself, who has always been half history and half legend, half known and half hidden. Her true face glimpsed only faintly through the layers of story piled upon her over the centuries. And here we come to the strangest and in its way the most powerful part of Cleopatra's story, which is what happened to her memory after her death. For a woman who lost everything, who was defeated so completely that her kingdom was erased, and her line extinguished, Cleopatra achieved a kind of immortality that few victorious conquerors ever match. Octavian won the war, became Augustus, ruled the Roman world, and is remembered as one of the great figures of history. But it is Cleopatra whose name still stirs the imagination across 2,000 years. Cleopatra who has been painted and sculpted and written about and portrayed on the stage and the screen more than almost any other figure of the ancient world. The woman her enemies tried to reduce to a villain, a temptress, a foreign threat, became instead one of the most enduringly fascinating human beings who ever lived, remembered long after the details of Octavian's victories have faded into the pages of textbooks. Why should this be so? Part of the answer lies in the very legend her enemies created, the image of the dangerous, seductive queen, which proved so vivid and dramatic that later ages could not stop retelling it. The great English playwright of centuries later would write a tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra that fixed the romantic image of the lovers in the imagination of the world. Painters would depict her death again and again, the queen with the serpent, dying in royal splendor. Films of the modern age would cast the most famous actresses of their day as Cleopatra, draped in gold, ruling with her eyes. The legend took on a life of its own, growing and changing with each retelling, until the real woman almost disappeared behind the glittering mask. But part of the answer lies deeper, in the truth beneath the legend, which is perhaps even more compelling than the myth. For the real Cleopatra was not the empty seductress of Roman propaganda. She was a woman of formidable intelligence and learning, a scholar who studied the sciences of her day, who spoke many languages, who wrote, according to some ancient references, works on subjects such as measurement and cosmetics and medicine. Though these do not survive, she was a capable administrator who governed a complex kingdom through years of famine and difficulty. She was a shrewd politician who, for more than 20 years, kept Egypt independent in an age when Rome was devouring every other kingdom in the Mediterranean, buying her country decades of survival through her skill, her alliances, and her sheer force of will. She was a mother fighting for the futures of her children. She was the last defender of an ancient civilization against the tide of a new and overwhelming power, and she fought that losing battle with courage and cleverness to the very end. We should also remember quietly how unusual it was for a woman to hold such power in that world at all. The ancient Mediterranean was overwhelmingly a world ruled by men, in which women were expected to remain in the background, their lives confined to the household, their voices seldom heard in the affairs of state. For a woman to rule a great kingdom in her own right, to negotiate as an equal with the most powerful men of her age, to command armies and fleets, and to shape the politics of the whole Eastern Mediterranean, was extraordinary. Part of the venom that the Romans directed at Cleopatra came precisely from this, from the deep discomfort that many Roman men felt at the sight of a woman wielding real power, a discomfort that shaped the hostile image they left of her. In a sense, the legend of Cleopatra, the dangerous temptress, was itself a kind of testimony to her power, an admission twisted into an accusation that this woman had been formidable enough to matter, formidable enough to frighten Rome. To find her truly, we must hold all of these things together at once, and resist the temptation to flatten her into any single image. She was not only the romantic lover of the legend, nor only the scheming villain of the propaganda, nor only the tragic heroine of the plays, nor only the feminist icon of more recent imagination. She was a real and complicated human being, a scholar and a queen, a mother and a politician, a woman of her own time and place, doing the best she could with the extraordinary and impossible hand that history had dealt her. She inherited a kingdom already in decline, already living in the shadow of Rome, and she spent her life trying to keep it alive. That she ultimately failed does not diminish her. It was perhaps an impossible task from the beginning. Rome was simply too large, too powerful, too relentless, and Egypt, for all its ancient glory, could not stand against it forever. Cleopatra did not fall because she was weak or foolish. She fell because she stood at the ending of an age, and no amount of intelligence or courage could hold back the tide that was carrying the whole old world into a new era. And so, when we think of Cleopatra now, across the vast distance of 2,000 years, perhaps the truest way to remember her is not as the temptress or the villain or even the tragic lover, but as a guardian at the gate of a dying world, the last keeper of an inheritance 3,000 years old, standing at the shore of her city with the great lighthouse burning behind her, watching the ships of a new empire come across the sea. She held her ground as long as any human being could. She matched wits with the masters of the world. She preserved her kingdom's independence for more than 2 decades in an age of conquest. And when the end came, she met it on her own terms, denying her conqueror his final triumph, choosing her own ending with the dignity of a queen descended from 100 kings. The world she belonged to is gone now, gone so completely that we can scarcely imagine it. The pharaohs are silent. The old gods of Egypt are worshipped no more. The library of Alexandria has crumbled into dust and memory. The great lighthouse has fallen into the sea. The The Ptolemaic kingdom and the Roman Republic that destroyed it, and even the Roman Empire that rose from Octavian's victory, have all passed away into history. Empires rise and fall again, and the mightiest powers of one age become the ruins and the bedtime stories of another. This, in the end, is the quiet lesson that whispers through Cleopatra's story, the same lesson that whispers through all the oldest stories of the human past. Nothing built by human hands lasts forever. Not the pyramids, though they have lasted longer than almost anything. Not the empires, however vast. Not the kingdoms, however ancient. All of it, in time, returns to the sand and the sea and the silence. And yet the memory endures. 2,000 years after her death, in a world she could never have imagined, in lands she never knew existed, people still speak the name of Cleopatra. They still wonder about her. They still search for her lost tomb. They still tell her story over and over. Each generation finding in her something new, something that speaks to them. The woman is gone, but the memory remains, carried forward across the centuries, like the light of that ancient lighthouse, still shining in the mind long after the tower itself has fallen. Perhaps that is the only immortality any of us can truly hope for. Not the immortality of stone and empire, which crumbles, but the immortality of memory, of being remembered, of having one's story told again and again in the quiet hours by those who came long after. Cleopatra understood, better than most, the longing to endure, the wish to hold on to something precious against the tide of time. She spent her life trying to preserve her kingdom, her line, her ancient inheritance. In the terms she would have understood, she failed. Egypt fell. Her line ended. Her world dissolved into the Roman Empire and then into all the ages that followed. But in another sense, one she could not have foreseen, she succeeded beyond all imagining. She has not been forgotten. She will not be forgotten. As long as there are people who love the old stories, who sit quietly in the evening and let their minds wander back to the ancient world, the last pharaoh of Egypt will live on, her name spoken softly in the dark, her story told once more, a small warm light kept burning against the vast and gentle night of the past. So let us leave her there, at rest at last, in her lost tomb somewhere beneath the sand or the sea of the city she loved, laid beside the man she chose, in the land she gave her life to preserve. Let the great lighthouse burn on in the imagination, throwing its patient light across the dark water of 2,000 years. Let the Nile flow on as it has always flowed, quiet and eternal, past the sleeping villages and the ancient temples, carrying its silt and its blessings down to the sea. Let the city of Alexandria settle into the peaceful dark, its scholars and its sailors and its markets, all long since gone to dust, its story kept safe now in the deep places of memory. And let the last pharaoh sleep, her long struggle over, her kingdom passed into legend, her name secure among the immortals of history, remembered and cherished across the ages, resting now in the quiet that comes to all things at the end of the long day. The night grows deep around us now. There is nothing more you need to hold on to, nothing more to remember or resolve. The old world has settled into its long rest, and it is time now for you to settle into yours. Let the images grow soft and distant, the golden barge upon the river, the queen at her window above the sea, the lighthouse burning far out in the dark, all of it fading now gently into the peaceful quiet of the past, where the great and the small alike lie down together at last and are at rest. Sleep now, the story will keep. The light will burn on without you tonight, and the ancient river will carry us all, in time gently down toward the sea. Perhaps you are still here, still awake in the soft dark, and if so, let us linger a while longer in Cleopatra's world, not hurrying toward any conclusion, for we have already reached the end of her life, but drifting instead through the quieter corners of that ancient time, the ordinary textures and daily rhythms that the grand story of queens and generals so often passes over. For history is not only made of battles and betrayals and famous deaths, it is made far more of morning bread and evening lamplight. of the work of countless hands whose names no one ever wrote down, of the small, unremarkable lives that filled the streets and fields and harbors beneath the notice of kings. And to truly rest inside a vanished world, it helps to feel not only its great events, but its gentle, everyday breath. So let us walk, in the imagination, through Alexandria as it was in Cleopatra's day, not as the stage of high politics, but as a living city where hundreds of thousands of ordinary people rose each morning and went about their lives. Imagine the dawn coming up over the eastern harbor, the sky paling from deep blue to rose and gold, the great lighthouse of Pharos still burning its night fire, the flame growing faint and unnecessary as the true sun rose behind it. The first light would touch the tops of the columns and the temple roofs, then slide slowly down the pale stone walls into the streets below, where the city was already stirring. Fishermen would have been out on the water since before dawn, their small boats bobbing in the two great harbors, drawing in nets heavy with the catch of the Mediterranean and the lake, and now they would be coming in to sell their fish in the markets, the silver bodies gleaming in baskets, the smell of the sea and the catch mingling in the cool morning air. The markets of Alexandria were among the richest in the world, for the city sat at one of the great crossroads of ancient trade. Here came goods from 3 continents and from lands beyond the edge of the known world. From the south, up the Nile and across from the Red Sea ports, came the treasures of Africa and the East, ivory and ebony, incense and myrrh, exotic animals and rare woods, and most precious of all, the spices and silks and gems that traveled the long routes from India and even faintly from distant China, passing through many hands before they reached the stalls of Alexandria. From across the Mediterranean came wine and olive oil, pottery and metalwork, marble and timber, and flowing outward in return went the one commodity above all others that made Egypt rich and coveted, grain, the golden wheat grown in the black soil of the Nile Valley, loaded by the shipload into the great grain vessels that fed the growing cities of the Mediterranean world. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world, and Alexandria was the port through which that bread flowed, and this simple fact of agriculture, of soil and river and harvest, lay beneath all the grand politics of the age. Rome wanted Egypt not only for glory but for grain, for the wheat that fed the Roman mob, and whoever controlled Egypt's harvest held a hand upon the throat of the ancient world. In the markets, the languages of many peoples mingled in the air. Greek was the common tongue of the city, the language of commerce and government and learning, spoken by the ruling class and by the diverse population of merchants and craftsmen. But beneath and alongside it, one would hear the ancient Egyptian language spoken by the native population, older by far than Greek, the tongue of the priests and the farmers and the deep countryside. One would hear the languages of the large Jewish community, which had lived in Alexandria for generations and formed one of the great centers of Jewish life outside their homeland, whose scholars had translated their sacred scriptures into Greek in that very city. One would hear the accents of Syrians and Arabs, of traders from the Red Sea, of visitors from every corner of the Mediterranean world. Alexandria was a city of many peoples living together, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in tension, a great mixing bowl of the ancient world, cosmopolitan in a way that few cities before it had ever been. Let us step away from the markets now into the quieter residential streets, where ordinary families lived their lives. The houses of the well-to-do were built around cool inner courtyards, open to the sky, where a little garden might grow, a fig tree perhaps, or a vine offering shade in the fierce heat of the Egyptian day. Water was precious and carefully managed, brought into the city through underground channels and stored in cisterns beneath the houses, drawn up as needed for cooking and washing and drinking. The rooms were often decorated with painted walls and mosaic floors, showing scenes of nature or myth, gods and animals and geometric patterns, for even people of moderate means like to bring beauty into their homes. Furniture was simple by our standards, low couches and tables, chests for storing clothing and valuables, oil lamps of clay or bronze that filled the rooms with soft light and a faint smell of burning oil as evening came on. The poorer people, of course, lived far more simply, in small cramped dwellings, sometimes several families sharing a building, their lives a constant labor to secure food and shelter. Slavery was woven through this world as it was through all the ancient world, and we should not pass over it in silence, though we need not dwell upon its cruelties. Many of the hands that built the city, that carried the goods, that served in the houses of the wealthy, that labored in the workshops, belonged to enslaved people who had no freedom and no choice in their lives. This was the shadow side of the ancient world's splendor, present in Egypt as everywhere else. A reminder that the beauty and wealth we admire from a distance rested always on the toil of many who shared in none of it. The historian who loves the ancient world must hold both truths at once, the wonder and the injustice, without letting either erase the other. As the day went on, the great public spaces of Alexandria filled with life. There were the gymnasia, where the Greek population exercised and educated their young men in the traditions of Greek learning and athletics. There were the temples, both Greek and Egyptian, where priests performed the daily rituals of the gods, offering incense and prayers and sacrifices, tending the sacred images, keeping the ancient observances that ordered the spiritual life of the city. The greatest of the Egyptian temples honored the gods that had been worshipped along the Nile for thousands of years, and the greatest of the newer cults honored a god called Serapis, a deity created by the early Ptolemies to blend Greek and Egyptian religious ideas into a single figure that both peoples could worship, housed in a magnificent temple called the Serapeum that rose above the city. This blending of Greek and Egyptian, this deliberate weaving together of two ancient traditions, was one of the distinctive achievements of Ptolemaic Alexandria, and it reflected the whole character of the Ptolemaic project, ruling an Egyptian land through a Greek elite, trying to bridge the gap between the two worlds. And of course there was the museum and the library, that great house of learning, where the scholars of the age pursued their studies. Let us imagine for a moment one of those scholars, an old man perhaps, spending his days among the scrolls, working by the light that fell through high windows, or by the flame of an oil lamp, when the day grew dim. He might be a mathematician working through the propositions of geometry that scholars of Alexandria had done so much to develop. He might be an astronomer, charting the movements of the stars and planets. For Alexandria was one of the great centers of ancient astronomy, where scholars measured the heavens with careful instruments and tried to understand the workings of the cosmos. He might be a physician studying the body and the arts of healing, for the medical school of Alexandria was famous throughout the ancient world. He might be a geographer, mapping the known world and reasoning about its shape and size. He might be a librarian, laboring at the endless task of collecting, copying, sorting, and cataloging the scrolls that poured into the library from across the world. His life was quiet, scholarly, devoted to knowledge, and he was part of a tradition that had made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean for nearly 3 centuries. Cleopatra herself was a product of this tradition, raised among such men and such learning, and it shaped her into the scholar queen she became. As evening fell across the city, the character of Alexandria changed again. The markets closed, the workshops fell quiet. Families gathered in their homes for the evening meal, which might be simple bread and vegetables and fish for the poor, or a more elaborate spread of meats and wines and delicacies for the wealthy. The oil lamps were lit, casting their warm glow across the courtyards and rooms. Out in the harbor, the great lighthouse kindled its night fire once more, the flame climbing into the darkening sky, throwing its light far out across the water to guide the ships still at sea toward the safety of the harbor. In the palace quarter along the shore, the royal residences glittered with lamplight, and perhaps on some evenings, the sound of music and feasting drifted out over the water from the halls where the queen entertained, and above it all, the stars came out, the same stars the astronomers of the museum studied, wheeling slowly across the sky as they had wheeled over Egypt since the beginning of time, over the pyramids and the temples, and the long, slow river, over the countless generations of people who had lived and worked and dreamed and died along its banks. Now let us leave the city entirely and travel in the imagination up the Nile, into the countryside, into the deep ancient heart of Egypt that lay beyond the Greek capital. For it was there, far more than in cosmopolitan Alexandria, that the true and timeless Egypt endured. As one traveled south from the coast, up the great river, the world of Greek learning and Mediterranean trade gave way to a landscape and a way of life that had scarcely changed in thousands of years. Here were the villages of the Egyptian farmers, clusters of mud brick houses along the riverbanks, surrounded by the green fields that the Nile's flood made fertile. Here the people spoke the old Egyptian tongue, worshipped the old Egyptian gods, and lived by the ancient rhythm of the river, a rhythm older than any king or dynasty. That rhythm governed everything. In the summer, the river rose, swollen by rains that fell far to the south, in lands the Egyptians themselves had never seen, and the flood spread across the land, covering the fields with water and rich dark silt. During the flood, farm work stopped, and this was often the time when labor was gathered for great building projects, or for maintaining the canals and dikes that controlled the water. As the flood receded, it left behind the fertile mud, and the farmers went out to plant their crops in the renewed soil, sowing wheat and barley and flax. Through the growing season they tended the fields, drawing water where needed, watching the crops ripen under the strong Egyptian sun. And then came the harvest, the gathering of the grain that made Egypt rich, threshed and winnowed and stored, some kept for the village, much of it taken as taxes to feed the cities in the state, and increasingly to be shipped away across the sea. Then the cycle began again, the river rising once more, the eternal turning of the Egyptian year, as reliable and as sacred as the rising and setting of the sun. The lives of these farmers were hard but not without their beauty and their meaning. They lived close to the earth and the river, close to the gods who governed the natural world. Their religion was woven into the landscape around them, into the flood and the harvest, the birth and death and rebirth they saw enacted in the fields each year. They worshipped Osiris, the god of the dead and of resurrection, whose story of death and return mirrored the dying and reviving of the crops. They worshipped Isis, his devoted wife, the great mother goddess, protector of the living and the dead, whose worship would spread far beyond Egypt in the coming centuries, carried across the whole Roman world. They worshipped Horus and Hathor and a great host of gods and goddesses, some of them ancient beyond memory, and they buried their dead with care and reverence, preserving the body, providing goods for the afterlife, following practices that reached back into the deepest antiquity. For the Egyptians, more than almost any people, believed in the continuation of life beyond death, in the survival of the soul, in a world beyond this one where the dead lived on. The great temples of this ancient Egypt still stood along the river, and many still functioned, tended by their priests. As one traveled up the Nile, one would pass them, rising above the fields and the villages, immense structures of stone that had stood for centuries or millennia, their walls covered in the carved figures and hieroglyphic writing that recorded the deeds of gods and kings. At Thebes, far to the south, stood the vast temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, forests of towering columns raised in honor of the gods, their ceilings once painted with stars, their walls telling the sacred stories of Egypt. Nearby, in the desert valleys, lay the tombs of the pharaohs of ages past, the great kings of Egypt's golden age, hidden away with their treasures, though many had already been robbed in the long centuries since their burial. And everywhere stood the monuments of the deep past, the obelisks and statues and temples of a civilization so old that even in Cleopatra's day it was already ancient, already a thing of wonder and reverence, its origins lost in the mists of time. Cleopatra, unlike her ancestors, understood this ancient Egypt and reached out to it. She learned the Egyptian language, as we have seen, the first of her dynasty to do so. She presented herself to the Egyptian people not merely as a Greek queen, but as a true pharaoh in the ancient tradition, participating in the old religious ceremonies, associating herself with the goddess Isis, honoring the ancient gods in temples. She had herself depicted on temple walls in the traditional Egyptian style, as pharaohs had been depicted for 3,000 years. making offerings to the gods in the timeless poses of Egyptian royal art. In this way, she bound herself to the deep past of the land she ruled, seeking to be not just a foreign ruler imposed upon Egypt, but a legitimate heir to its ancient kingship, the living continuation of a tradition that stretched back to the very beginning. It was, in part, shrewd politics, a way of securing the loyalty of the Egyptian population, but it may also have reflected a genuine understanding on Cleopatra's part of what she was and what she represented, a sense that she stood at the end of an immensely long story, the last guardian of an ancient and sacred inheritance. And this, perhaps, is the deepest way to understand the meaning of her fall. When Cleopatra died and Egypt passed to Rome, it was not merely the end of a dynasty or the loss of a kingdom's independence. It was the end of the pharaohs, the closing of a chapter of human history 3,000 years long. For 3 millennia, Egypt had been ruled by its own kings, its own pharaohs, living links between the human and the divine, keepers of the sacred order, embodiments of the ancient tradition. Dynasties had risen and fallen. Foreign conquerors had come and gone. The Persians had ruled and been driven out. Alexander had come, and his general Ptolemy had founded a new line. But always through it all, there had been a pharaoh in Egypt, a king who performed the ancient rites, who maintained the cosmic order, who stood as the head of the timeless Egyptian world. With Cleopatra, that ended. There would be no more pharaohs. Egypt became a province of Rome, ruled by a distant emperor who cared for its grain, but not for its gods. And the ancient tradition of Egyptian kingship, unbroken for 3,000 years, came at last to its close. The old religion would linger on for centuries yet. The temples still functioning, the priests still performing their rites, the people still worshipping Isis and Osiris and the ancient gods. But slowly over the following centuries that too would fade. The Roman emperors would eventually turn against the old religions as Christianity rose and spread. The temples would be closed, the priesthoods dissolved, the ancient ceremonies forbidden, the knowledge of how to read the hieroglyphic writing, the sacred script of Egypt in which the wisdom of 3,000 years was recorded, would be lost. So completely lost that for well over 1,000 years no one on earth could read the writing on the walls of the Egyptian temples, and the meaning of those carved inscriptions became a total mystery, until, in the modern age, scholars finally cracked the code and learned once more to read the words of the ancient Egyptians. But by then the living tradition was long gone. The last person who could truly read the old sacred script had died many centuries before, and with them died the last thread connecting the living world to the ancient civilization of the pharaohs. So the fall of Cleopatra marked, in a sense, the beginning of the long twilight of ancient Egypt, the slow fading of a world that had endured longer than almost any other in human history. It did not vanish all at once. Nothing so old and so deep vanishes all at once. It faded slowly, over centuries, the temples falling silent one by one, the old gods worshipped by fewer and fewer, the ancient knowledge slipping away, until at last the civilization of the pharaohs became a thing entirely of the past, a mystery buried in the sand, a wonder for later ages to rediscover and marvel at. And Cleopatra stands at the threshold of that long fading, the last of the pharaohs, the final ruler of independent Egypt, the woman who fought to preserve a world that was already, though she may not have fully known it, passing away. There is a great tenderness in this, when we sit with it quietly in the dark, to be the last of something ancient and beautiful, to stand at the ending of a long story and to fight, with all one's intelligence and courage, to keep it alive a little longer, knowing perhaps in one's deepest heart that the fight cannot ultimately be won. Cleopatra did not save Egypt. Egypt could not be saved. Not against the overwhelming power of Rome, not against the great tide of history that was sweeping the whole old world into a new age, but she fought for it, and she gave it more than 20 years of survival that it might not otherwise have had. And when the end came, she met it with a dignity that has commanded respect across 2,000 years, even from those who counted her an enemy. She was faithful to her inheritance to the very last. She did not abandon her kingdom or flee to save herself. She stayed and she fought. And when there was nothing left to fight for, she chose her own ending rather than betray, by her humiliation, the ancient dignity of the crown she wore. And so we come back, at the last, to that image of the guardian at the gate of a dying world. Picture her once more, in the imagination, standing on the shore of Alexandria in the evening light, the city rising behind her, the great lighthouse kindling its flame against the coming dark, the sea stretching away toward the west where the ships of Rome would come. Behind her, up the long river, lay the ancient heart of Egypt, the temples and the tombs and the villages, the farmers in their fields, the priests in their sanctuaries, the whole immense weight of 3,000 years of civilization resting in a sense upon her shoulders. And before her lay the future, the coming of Rome, the ending of her world, the long twilight of the pharaohs. She stood between the two, the last of the old and the herald, unwilling of the new, holding her ground as long as any human being could, keeper of the flame until the very end. The flame went out. In the end, as all flames do, Egypt fell. The pharaohs were no more. The old world gave way to the new, but the memory of that last keeper of the flame has never gone out, and it burns still faint and warm, across the vast dark distance of 2,000 years. A small light kept alive in the imagination of all who love the old stories and who pause, sometimes in the quiet of the evening, to remember the woman who fought for a dying world and who has become, in her defeat, immortal. And now the night has grown very deep indeed, and it is truly time to let the story rest. We have walked a long way together from the founding of Alexandria to the death of the last pharaoh, from the marble libraries and salt harbors of the great city to the ancient villages along the timeless river, from the high politics of queens and generals to the quiet daily lives of fishermen and farmers and scholars. We have followed Cleopatra through exile and civil war, through her alliances with the masters of Rome, through her long struggle to preserve her kingdom, to her sorrowful and dignified end, and we have seen how, in losing everything, she gained a kind of immortality that no conqueror could take from her, living on in memory across the ages, remembered and wondered at long after the empires of her time have crumbled into dust. There is nothing more, now, that you need to hold. The story is complete. The last pharaoh sleeps in her lost tomb somewhere beneath the sand or the sea of the city she loved. The great lighthouse has long since fallen into the waves. The library has crumbled into memory. The old gods are silent, and the ancient river flows on as it has always flowed, quiet and patient and eternal, carrying its silt and its blessings down to the sea, past the sleeping land where a great civilization once lived and dreamed and passed away. All is quiet now. All is at rest. The old world has settled into its long, peaceful sleep, and it is time at last for you to settle into yours. Let the final images grow soft and dim and distant. The queen upon the shore in the evening light, the lighthouse flame against the darkening sky, the temples standing silent along the river, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, the same stars that shone on Alexandria 2,000 years ago, that shine on us still, and that will shine on long after we too have passed into memory. Let it all fade gently now into the deep and gentle dark, where the great and the small alike lie down together at the end of the long day and are at peace. Sleep now. The story is told, the light is kept, and the ancient river carries us all, in time, gently and without fear, down toward the wide and quiet sea. Rest well, the old world keeps its long watch, and the night will hold you softly until morning.